A street violinist played a haunting melody outside a nightclub, unaware the vampire king inside froze mid-conversation. What she didn't know, it was his wedding song from 400 years ago, the night his bride was murdered. Now he stood in the doorway, rain soaking his coat, unable to look away from the girl whose fingers remembered what history had buried. The rain had turned 10th Avenue into a river of neon and car lights, each droplet catching the glow from Club Nocturne's entrance like scattered diamonds across black asphalt. Mira tucked her violin case closer to the brick wall, trying to keep the instrument dry while her coat soaked through to her shirt. 11:47 on a Thursday night meant the first wave of club patrons would stumble out soon, drunk enough to be generous but sober enough to find their wallets. And she needed another $60 to make rent without dipping into the grocery money she shared with her roommates. The violin's chin rest was cold against her jaw as she lifted the bow, fingers finding their positions through muscle memory built over 18 years of practice. Back when she still believed the conservatory would lead somewhere other than a studio apartment in Bushwick, with water stains on the ceiling and a landlord who didn't fix the heat. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. She had found the music at an estate sale in Queens last Tuesday, a whole box of water-damaged books for $10, and most of it was trash, hymns, and simplified Mozart. But this one piece had stopped her cold when she played through it that first night. The notation was handwritten in brown ink, the paper brittle at the edges, and someone had titled it simply EV, followed by the year 1624, which seemed impossible because paper that old should have disintegrated by now, but the melody itself was what mattered. It was haunting in a way that made her chest ache, a rising line that felt like a question being asked over and over without answer. And she had been playing it every night since because people stopped when they heard it, really stopped, instead of just tossing coins while scrolling through their phones. Inside Club Nocturne, beyond the velvet ropes and the soundproofed glass that cost more than her entire year's rent, Elias Voss sat in the VIP section with his spine straight against leather upholstery that had been dyed the color of dried blood. Sebastian was talking, his words precise and clipped the way they always were when he wanted to seem reasonable. Something about the territorial dispute in Brooklyn Heights, and whether the Vampire King would permit the European delegation to establish a feeding grounds near the promenade. Elias heard the words, but they slid past him like water over stone, because beneath Sebastian's voice, and the pulsing bass from the main floor, and the laughter of humans who had no idea they were drinking 30 feet below a council of predators, there was a melody. It cut through the soundproofed glass like a blade through silk, impossible and undeniable. And for a moment Elias thought he had finally lost his mind the way Sebastian always predicted he would, grief turning to madness after 4 centuries of walking through a world that no longer held the only person who had made him feel human. The melody climbed and turned, and he was no longer in Club Nocturne, but standing in the villa outside Florence, the one with the garden that smelled of rosemary and lavender even in October. Elena sat at the virginal, her fingers dancing across the keys, and she was laughing because she always rushed the third measure when she got excited, speeding through the notes like she couldn't wait to reach the resolution. Candlelight caught in her dark hair, turned her skin to honey and cream, and she looked up at him with eyes that knew exactly what he was, had known since the 2nd month of their courtship, and loved him anyway. She played their wedding song, the one she had composed herself, and told him it wasn't finished yet, that she needed to write the rest, but there would be time. They had all the time in the world. Except they didn't. The glass in Elias's hand shattered against the marble table, red wine spreading like blood across white stone. Sebastian stopped mid-sentence. Camilla and Marcus, the other council members, went silent, their predator eyes fixed on him with the wariness of creatures who understood that broken composure meant danger. For 400 years, nothing had broken Elias's composure. Not territorial wars or council challenges, or the endless gray march of decades that all bled together into a single long night. But that melody shattered it like the glass now glittering on the table. He stood without explanation, his chair scraping against polished concrete, and walked toward the entrance. The club's manager tried to intercept him, but Elias moved past without acknowledgement, pushed through the double doors into rain that soaked his coat in seconds. The cold meant nothing to him, had meant nothing since 1623, when his body stopped responding to temperature the way living things should. But he felt it anyway, registered the water running down his collar and into his shirt as he stood in the doorway watching the street violinist play. She was small, Asian features partially hidden by wet hair plastered to her cheeks, and her violin case sat open at her feet with a scatter of bills inside. She wore a coat that had seen better years and boots that needed resoling, and her playing was technically proficient but not virtuosic, the work of someone who had trained seriously but never quite reached the level where orchestras came calling. None of that mattered because her fingers were playing Elena's song, the melody Elena had composed for their wedding night, and she was making the same mistake Elena always made, rushing the third measure in her eagerness to reach the turn. Elias felt something crack open in his chest, something he had sealed away so long ago he had forgotten it could still break. Sebastian appeared behind him, silent as a shadow despite his expensive shoes and tailored suit. "What are you doing?" Sebastian asked, his voice pitched low enough that only vampire ears could catch it over the rain and traffic. Elias didn't turn, couldn't take his eyes off the girl's fingers moving across the strings, each note a small, precise death. "Listening to a ghost," he said. The violinist finished the song and lowered her bow, flexing her left hand to work out the stiffness that came from playing in the cold. Her violin case held $43 in assorted bills, which meant she was still 17 short of whatever goal she had set for the night, and Mira found herself hoping the next group of club patrons would be the generous kind of drunk instead of the handsy kind. She became aware of the man watching her before she looked up, some instinct that came from 3 years of playing on street corners, teaching her to distinguish between people who were just passing by and people who were focused on her with intent. He stood in Club Nocturne's entrance, rain soaking through a coat that probably cost more than her violin, and he wasn't smiling. He wasn't drunk either, she could tell that from the way he held himself, perfectly still in a way that made her skin prickle with warning. Dangerous, something whispered in the back of her mind. Predator. But she needed the money, and dangerous men sometimes tipped well if you didn't show fear, so she met his eyes and waited. He crossed the sidewalk, moving with a grace that seemed wrong somehow, too fluid, too controlled, and stopped just outside the invisible boundary of her performance space. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked. His voice was careful, each word placed with precision, and Mira's shoulders went tight with familiar defensiveness because she had dealt with this before. Men who thought buying a musician's time meant owning a piece of them. "Estate sale," she said. "Why?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying her face like he was looking for something specific, and up close she could see his eyes were gray, the kind of gray that reminded her of winter skies and old steel. He seemed to be working through some internal calculation, weighing options she couldn't see, and the silence stretched long enough that she almost told him to move along. She had work to do. Then he spoke again. "I will pay you $5,000 to play at a private event tomorrow night." Mira's first instinct was to laugh, because nobody offered that kind of money for a street violinist. But his expression didn't change, and she realized he was serious. $5,000 would cover 3 months of rent, make a dent in her student loans, let her fix the crack in her violin soundboard that she had been ignoring for 2 years. It was too much money, way too much, which meant there was a catch. There was always a catch. "What kind of event?" she asked. "Private," he repeated, which wasn't an answer. "Why so much?" He went quiet again, and Mira watched emotions flicker across his face too fast to name, grief and longing, and something that looked like pain. "It was my wife's favorite song," he said finally. "She died a long time ago." The rain fell harder, turning the street into a blur of light and sound, and Mira felt her suspicion war with something else, something that recognized the truth in his voice when he talked about his dead wife. She thought about her mentor, Dr. Reeves, who had died of a heart attack in his office 2 years ago. How she still sometimes picked up her phone to call him before remembering he was gone. She understood grief, understood the way it could make people do strange things, hold on to fragments of the past like they were pieces of a sinking ship. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow night. Where?" He reached into his coat and produced a business card, heavy stock with embossed lettering that read Voss Antiquities, and gave an address in Tribeca. His fingers brushed hers when he handed it over, and she suppressed a shiver at how cold his skin felt, colder than the rain, colder than seemed possible for a living person. 8 o'clock, he said. "Bring the sheet music." Mira nodded and tucked the card into her violin case, suddenly wanting this interaction to be over, wanting to be back in her apartment with the door locked and her roommates chattering about their day jobs and everything normal and safe. The man watched her pack up her violin with that same unnerving stillness, watched her tuck the case under her arm and count the bills in her pocket, watched her turn toward the subway entrance 2 blocks down. She didn't look back, but she felt his gaze on her spine until she descended the stairs into the tunnel's fluorescent brightness. Sebastian materialized beside Elias as the girl disappeared from view, his presence announced by the faint scent of the cologne he insisted on wearing, despite having no need to mask his scent from humans. "The council will not like this," Sebastian said. Elias finally turned away from the empty street, rain streaming down his face and dripping from his hair, and for the first time in decades Sebastian saw something in his expression that wasn't the careful mask of the vampire king. "The council does not need to know," Elias said, and walked back into the club, leaving Sebastian standing in the rain with an uneasy certainty that something had shifted, that the carefully maintained balance of the past 4 centuries was about to fracture in ways none of them could predict. Mira woke to sunlight cutting through the gap in her curtains and the smell of burnt toast from the kitchen where Jenna was probably attempting breakfast again. Her phone said 9:30, which meant she had slept through her alarm, and the business card on her nightstand seemed less real in daylight, the embossed letters almost mocking in their elegance. She picked it up and turned it over, half expecting to find it blank. But the address was still there, Voss Antiquities in Tribeca, and she opened her laptop to do what any sensible person would do before walking into a stranger's private event for an absurd amount of money. The internet offered surprisingly little about Elias Voss. His antiquities business had a minimal website with contact information and a disclaimer about appointments only, no walk-ins. She found his name attached to a few high-end art auctions, rare manuscripts, and Renaissance paintings that sold for 6 or 7 figures, and one charity gala photo from 3 years ago where a tall figure in the background was turned away from the camera. Only a suggestion of dark hair and expensive tailoring. No social media, no interviews, no personal information beyond the business records, which struck her as strange because even reclusive millionaires usually left some digital footprint. Jenna appeared in her doorway, holding a plate with blackened bread and peanut butter, already dressed in her scrubs for the evening shift at the hospital. "You look like you're researching a serial killer," Jenna said. "Please tell me last night's mysterious rich guy is not a serial killer." Mira closed the laptop and tried to sound casual. "He wants me to play at a private event. $5,000. Jenna nearly dropped her toast. "That is either the best gig of your life or the setup for a true crime podcast. Probably both. You are bringing pepper spray." "I am bringing pepper spray," Mira agreed, and she meant it. Tucking the small canister into her violin case later that afternoon, alongside rosin and extra strings and the water-damaged sheet music that had started all of this. She told herself it was just a job, just a grieving widower who wanted to hear his dead wife's favorite song, but her hands shook slightly as she locked the case, and she could not shake the memory of how cold his fingers had been when they brushed hers. In the villa outside Florence, Elena played the wedding song one last time, her fingers dancing across the virginal keys with the joy of someone who believed the future stretched out endlessly before her. Elias stood behind her, watching candlelight turn her hair to silk and shadow, and he had never told her what he was, could not find the words to explain that the man she had married was no longer entirely human. He had been changed only a year before meeting her, a desperate bargain with a vampire lord who found him dying from a hunting accident in the hills above Rome, and he had been trying to find a way back to mortality ever since, chasing rumors of cures and transformations that might let him grow old beside the woman he loved. Elena finished the song and turned to him with eyes that saw more than he gave her credit for. "You are troubled," she said. "Tell me." Before he could answer, before he could finally speak the truth that sat like lead in his chest, the villa doors exploded inward. Hooded men with crossbows and silver blades, vampire hunters who had tracked him across Italy, and they were shouting about demons and hellspawn and cleansing fire. Elena screamed his name, and Elias moved with the speed that still felt unnatural, throwing himself between her and the bolts that whistled through the air. He killed 3 of them before he realized the 4th had gone around, had reached Elena while Elias was occupied, and when he turned, she was already falling, blood spreading across her wedding dress in a bloom of red. He caught her before she hit the floor, killing the last hunter with his bare hands, tearing through flesh and bone with a savagery that would haunt him for centuries. The wedding song still echoed from the virginal, the mechanism continuing to play even as Elena's breath grew shallow. She looked up at him, and her eyes were afraid but not surprised, and he understood in that moment that she had known all along what he was. A vampire lord appeared in the doorway, drawn by the violence, ancient and powerful, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Elias begged him for help, offered anything, everything, and the Lord laughed. "I can make you stronger," the Lord said, "strong enough that you will never lose anyone like this again, strong enough to be truly immortal. But I cannot bring back the dead." The transformation took Elena's last breaths as its soundtrack, her hand going cold in his, as power flooded through him, and remade him into something that could no longer die, could no longer change, could no longer be anything but exactly what he was in that moment of perfect grief. When it was over, Elena was gone, and Elias was a vampire king, and the song had stopped playing. Elias stood in his Tribeca penthouse and ordered the staff to clear out, all the assistants and housekeepers and security personnel who normally occupied the space during evening hours. He needed privacy for what came next, needed to make sure no human witnesses saw anything that might require memory alteration or worse. Council law was explicit about private dealings with humans, the rules put in place after too many vampires had been careless and forced the council to clean up exposure incidents. Any extended private contact required a neutral witness, someone to ensure the vampire did not feed, did not turn, did not reveal their nature without proper protocols. He called Amara Okonkwo because she was the only council member he trusted to be discreet, and she arrived at 7 with her usual expression of mild disapproval. "If you are doing what I think you are doing," Amara said, settling into one of his minimalist chairs like a queen on a throne, "you are violating the mourning statute. Attempting to recreate a dead bond is classified as instability." "I am hiring a musician," Elias said. "That is all." Amara had been a vampire for 200 years, long enough to read the lies people told themselves, and she looked at him with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. "The mourning statute exists because vampires who cannot let go of their human loves go mad. You know this. You helped write it." "I am not recreating anything," Elias insisted. "I simply want to hear the song." Amara did not argue further, but her silence was eloquent. and Elias turned away from her knowing gaze to retrieve the locked box from his vault. Inside, wrapped in archival cloth, lay Elena's original sheet music, all 12 pages written in her hand with the brown ink she preferred. The violin part was complete, but the virginal part existed only in fragments, sketched harmonies and unfinished phrases, because she had always meant to write it down properly and never found the time. He had kept it safe for 4 centuries, stored in climate-controlled darkness like a relic of a saint, and touching it now felt like pressing on a bruise that had never healed. Mira arrived at 8 exactly, her violin case slung over one shoulder and her expression carefully neutral as she took in the penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson and its stark white walls, broken only by a collection of Renaissance paintings that probably cost more than her entire building. Amara introduced herself as a colleague, her British accent smooth and cultured, and Mira shook her hand while trying not to stare at the art. Elias gestured to a chair positioned near the windows. "Please," he said, "play what you have." Mira unpacked her violin and set the 3 water-damaged pages on a music stand he had provided, and when she began to play, Elias closed his eyes and let himself fall into memory. Elena's face came to him clearly for the first time in decades, not the dying face from that last night, but the living one, bright with joy and mischief and fearless love. The melody climbed and turned, and Mira played it almost exactly as Elena had, rushing the 3rd measure in her eagerness, her vibrato warm and alive. Then she stopped. "This is incomplete," Mira said, lowering her bow. "The melody does not resolve. Where is the rest?" Elias could have lied, could have told her this was all that existed, but something in her directness demanded honesty. He retrieved the box and opened it carefully, lifting out the 12 pages of vellum with hands that had not trembled in 400 years. Mira's eyes went wide as he laid them on the piano. "The handwriting is archaic Italian," she said, moving closer. "The paper is genuine 17th century vellum. This belongs in a museum. How did you get this?" "It was my wife's," Elias said. "I have kept it safe." Mira picked up the first page with reverent fingers, studying the notation, and her expression shifted from wonder to confusion. "This is only the violin part. Where is the keyboard accompaniment?" "She always said she would write it down someday," Elias said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "She never did." Mira looked up at him, and something in her face softened with understanding. "I could arrange it," she said. "Reconstruct the harmony from the violin line, if you want." "Yes," Elias said, too quickly, and across the room Amara's eyes narrowed in warning, because this crossed the line from hiring to collaboration, from business transaction to personal involvement, and council law required full disclosure before a human could be brought into a vampire's intimate affairs. Over the next week, Mira came to the penthouse 3 evenings, arriving after sunset with staff paper and pencils, and a determination that reminded Elias painfully of Elena's focus when she was composing. She worked at his piano, playing through phrases and testing harmonies, her hands moving over the keys with confidence that bordered on recklessness. On the first night, she asked about his wife, and he said, "Elena, she was fearless," keeping his answer deliberately vague about time and place. On the 3rd night, he found himself watching Mira's hands too closely, seeing the way they moved like Elena's had, not identical but similar in their expressive certainty. On the 5th night, she played the reconstructed duet with a recording of the violin part playing through speakers, and the sound was so perfectly right that Elias had to leave the room before she could see his face. Mira was beginning to notice things. His apartment had no mirrors anywhere, not in the bathroom or the hallways or above the mantelpiece where a mirror would normally hang. He never ate or drank when she was there, not even water, and he knew far too much about 17th century musical notation for someone who claimed to be simply an antiquities dealer. She did not ask directly, but her glances grew longer, more assessing, and Elias knew he was running out of time before her questions became unavoidable. Sebastian arrived on the 6th night, appearing in the penthouse after Mira had left, his expression grim. "You are being watched," Sebastian said. "The mourning statute exists for a reason. Vampires who try to resurrect dead bonds go mad. End this now." "It is just music," Elias said. "The girl is starting to ask questions," Sebastian continued. "Either compel her to forget or register her as a knowing human. You have 72 hours. On the seventh night, Mira completed the full arrangement, 12 pages of reconstructed harmony that wove around the violin melody, like a conversation between lovers. She looked up from the piano with bright eyes. "I want to perform it with you," she said. "Do you have a virginal in storage? You seem like the type who would." Elias hesitated only a moment before taking her down to the climate-controlled vault in the building's basement. The virginal sat in archival wrapping, untouched since he had moved it from Florence in 1887, and when he uncovered it, Mira gasped. The wood was dark with age, but perfectly preserved, and carved into the frame were the initials EV in an ornate script. "Your wife," Mira said slowly. "When exactly did she die?" Elias did not answer. "The paper, the instrument, the way you talk about her," Mira continued, her voice rising. "Elias, how old are you?" Amara stepped from the shadows where she had been observing, her presence suddenly filling the vault with authority. "He is 438 years old," Amara said. "And you have been playing his dead wife's song for a vampire king who has broken 6 council laws to keep you here." Mira grabbed her violin case and backed toward the door, her face pale. "This is insane. You are all insane. I did not mean to deceive you," Elias said, and he let her see the truth in his face. The centuries of loneliness and the desperate hope that had seized him when he heard her playing in the rain. "When I heard you play, it was the first time in 4 centuries I have felt anything but cold." "Prove it," Mira said, her back against the vault door. "If you are a vampire, prove it." Elias let his fangs extend, the transformation taking less than a second, and he moved with inhuman speed to stand beside the window where his reflection should have been, and was not. Mira stared at the empty glass, at the fangs, at the impossible reality in front of her, and she did not scream. She sat down on the floor and laughed, the sound edging toward hysteria. "This is insane," she said again. "You are insane. I am insane for not running. You can leave," Amara said, her voice gentle. "We will erase your memory and you can go back to your life. Or you can stay, finish the song, and register as a knowing human under his protection. But you need to decide now." Mira looked at the completed sheet music still sitting on the piano in the penthouse above them, looked at Elias who stood utterly still, waiting for her judgment. "If I stay," she said finally, "will you tell me what really happened to Elena?" Mira stared at the document spread across the mahogany table in Elias's penthouse, the parchment so old it seemed to breathe with its own history, yet the ink forming the contract terms looked freshly written in a script that shifted between English and something older she could not quite read. Amara stood beside her with hands folded, her 200 years of existence compressed into a posture of patient witnessing, while Elias remained by the window overlooking the Hudson, as though he could not bear to watch what came next. The contract was simple in its cruelty and clear in its protection, a binding supernatural agreement that would register Mira as a knowing human under the protection of Elias Voss, vampire king of the New York territory, and once she signed there would be no unknowing, no return to the comfortable ignorance that had insulated her from the truth that predators walked among humanity wearing human faces. She picked up the pen, an antique fountain pen that Amara provided, and felt its weight like an anchor pulling her down into depths she could not measure. The terms scrolled through her mind as she read them again, committing each clause to memory, even though Amara had explained them twice already in her precise British accent that made supernatural law sound almost reasonable. Mira could not reveal vampire existence to any human not already registered, and if she broke silence, her memory would be forfeit. Not just the memories of vampires, but everything connected to them, which might mean weeks or months or even years, depending on how deeply the supernatural had woven itself through her life. If Elias harmed her, fed from her without explicit consent, attempted to turn her without proper council authorization, or used compulsion to override her free will, he would forfeit his title and all holdings and protections that came with his position as territorial king. The contract bound both of them, a chain with two ends, and Mira understood that signing meant stepping into a world where the rules she had always believed governed reality were merely suggestions laid over a deeper and more dangerous truth. "He is not doing this for the music," Amara said quietly, her dark eyes fixed on Mira with an intensity that suggested she could see through flesh to the doubts and fears churning underneath. "He is doing it because you remind him of her. That is not love, Miss Chen. That is haunting." Mira looked at Elias, at his silhouette against the city lights, at the rigid line of his shoulders that spoke of 4 centuries carrying grief like stones in his pockets. "What if I want to be haunted?" Mira said. And she meant it, because the alternative was going back to her studio apartment and her subway performances, and the slow suffocation of a life that felt increasingly like waiting for permission to begin. "Then you are a fool," Amara replied without malice. "But at least you will be a protected fool." Mira signed her name in quick strokes before she could reconsider, and the moment the pen lifted from the parchment, the contract flared with a light that had no source, the signature burning itself into the document with a finality that felt like a door closing. Amara took the contract, and it vanished from her hands in a way that made Mira's eyes hurt to follow, filing itself through supernatural channels to whatever archive the council maintained for tracking the humans who knew too much. "You are registered now," Amara said, "protected and bound." Elias turned from the window and his face was unreadable, centuries of practice at concealing emotion, leaving his expression as smooth and cold as marble. "Tell me what really happened to Elena," Mira said, because if she was going to be haunted by a dead woman, she wanted to know the whole truth, not just the sanitized version Elias had offered in fragments. Elias closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something in his face had cracked, the careful control slipping just enough to show the wound underneath. "Elena Vittoria," he began, his voice soft and distant as though he were speaking from across centuries rather than across a room. "Daughter of minor Florentine nobility, born in 1601, brilliant and defiant in a world that wanted women silent and decorative. She composed music when composition was considered a masculine art, performed at salons where she was tolerated because her father's wealth bought her a seat at tables that should have been closed to her. I met her in 1623 at one of those salons, heard her play a virginal piece she had written herself, and I knew immediately that I would marry her or spend eternity regretting that I had not tried." He moved away from the window, began pacing the length of the penthouse as though movement could outdistance memory. "I had been changed only a year before, turned by a vampire lord who found me dying from a riding accident in the hills outside Rome and decided I was interesting enough to save. I was still learning what I was, still hoped I could find some way back to mortality, some ritual or cure that would let me grow old beside the woman I loved. I married Elena without telling her the truth. Convinced myself I could protect her from what I had become, and for 6 months we lived in a villa outside Florence, and I pretended I was still human." His voice dropped lower, each word costing him something. "On our wedding night, vampire hunters broke into the villa. They had been tracking me across Italy, but their intelligence was incomplete. They knew a vampire had married into the Vittoria family, but not which member of the household was the monster. Elena saw them threatening me, and she stepped between us with nothing but a fireplace poker and her fury, told them they would have to kill her before they touched her husband. So they did. They shot her through the heart thinking she was the vampire, realized their mistake when her blood was red and warm, and by the time I killed them all, she was already dying on the floor where we had danced hours before. Mira felt something cold settle in her chest. What did you do? I begged a passing vampire lord to save her, Elias said. He laughed at me, told me he could make me strong enough that I would never lose anyone again, but he could not bring back the dead. He changed me fully that night, completed the transformation while Elena bled out in my arms, and when it was finished, I was a vampire king and she was gone. The song was still playing, he added, his voice breaking slightly. The virginal had a mechanical component that kept the melody going even after her hands left the keys, and it played her wedding song while she died and I changed and the hunters' bodies cooled around us. Mira swallowed hard against the horror of it. And the hunters. I spent 400 years hunting their descendants, Elias said flatly. The Giordano family, vampire hunters for 6 generations. I tracked them across Europe, killed them one by one, erased the bloodline from existence. The last one died in 1893 in Prague, a 12-year-old boy who did not even know what his family had been. I cut his throat and felt nothing. Mira stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You killed a child. I killed the bloodline that took her from me, Elias corrected, his eyes meeting hers without shame or apology. And it changed nothing. Elena was still gone. The revenge was hollow. The song was all I had left of her, and even that was incomplete because she never finished writing the keyboard part. You are not trying to remember her, Mira said slowly, understanding crystallizing into words. You are trying to stay stuck. You want to live in that moment forever, in the grief and the guilt, because moving forward means admitting she is really gone. Elias went very still, and something flashed across his face, rage or recognition or both, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone cold with the kind of formality that was itself a weapon. The arrangement is complete, he said. I will transfer the remaining payment to your account tomorrow. Thank you for your services, Miss Chen. The warmth that had been building between them over the week of working together, the careful collaboration, and the moments when their hands had nearly touched over the piano keys, all of it vanished like smoke, and Mira understood that she had touched something too raw, had pushed against a wound that 4 centuries had not healed. She gathered her violin case without arguing, let herself out of the penthouse, and only when she was in the elevator descending toward the lobby did she let herself feel the ache in her chest that felt like unfinished music, like a melody cut off mid-phrase. 3 days passed in a silence that felt deliberately maintained, Elias not calling and Mira not reaching out, both of them circling the unspoken hurt like boxers in their corners. Then the paparazzi photo appeared on a gossip blog called Manhattan Excess that specialized in tracking the private lives of New York's ultra-wealthy with the dedication of hunters following blood trails. The image was grainy, shot from across the street with a telephoto lens, but it clearly showed Mira entering Elias's building for what the metadata confirmed was the 4th time in 7 days. Her violin case slung over one shoulder and her face turned slightly away from the camera as though she already sensed she was being watched. The captions speculated about a relationship, made jokes about sugar daddies and struggling artists, and used phrases like mystery woman and secretive billionaire that made Mira's stomach turn. Within hours, the photo had been picked up by 3 other gossip sites, each adding their own layer of innuendo and speculation, and Mira's phone exploded with texts from friends she had not spoken to in months, all of them wanting to know who the mysterious man was and whether she was okay and did she need them to come check on her. Jenna came home from her hospital shift carrying a printed copy of the photo and a look of deep concern etched into her face. Please tell me you know what you are doing, Jenna said, dropping the printout on the kitchen counter between them like evidence. I really do not, Mira admitted, because there was no point in lying to her roommate who had known her for 5 years and could read her moods like sheet music. The council met in emergency session that same evening in their underground chamber. The stone amphitheater that predated the subway system carved into bedrock beneath Manhattan, where human construction had never reached. Elias stood in the center of the circular floor, while Sebastian outlined the charges in a voice that carried the weight of formal accusation, exposure protocol violations that could result in forced relocation, or worse, depending on how the council voted. A human coming and going from a vampire king's residence drew exactly the kind of attention the council existed to prevent, Sebastian argued, and the fact that Mira was registered as a knowing human did not excuse the sloppiness of allowing paparazzi to document the connection. "This is not about a musician," Sebastian said, addressing the assembled council members who watched from their tiered seats with the stillness of predators waiting. "This is about a king who has become compromised by his attachment to a human. It makes him vulnerable. It makes all of us vulnerable." Elias was preparing his defense, marshalling arguments about the legality of hiring registered humans and the inevitability of some exposure in a city of 8 million, when Lord Constantine arrived uninvited, sweeping into the council chamber with an entourage of European vampires who had no business in New York territory. Constantine was old, perhaps 1,000 years, with the kind of beauty that looked carved from ice and eyes that held nothing but calculation layered over centuries of accumulated power. "I heard there was concern about a performance," Constantine said, in an accent that placed him somewhere in the Balkans, his voice carrying easily through the amphitheater. "I have come to hear this famous song that has occupied the Vampire King's attention so completely." It was a power move dressed as diplomatic courtesy, forcing Elias to either expose Mira to the full weight of vampire society or refuse and appear weak in front of rival factions who were already circling his territory with predatory interest, looking for any sign of vulnerability they could exploit. Sebastian looked at Elias with something almost like sympathy. "Council law allows for requests from visiting dignitaries," he said, and they both knew he was not actually asking. Elias had no choice without appearing to hide something, without confirming that he had something to hide. "I will arrange a private concert," Elias said, the words tasting like ash. The council chamber had been built 200 years ago, a stone amphitheater carved into the bedrock beneath what was now the financial district, existing in the spaces between subway tunnels and building foundations where human workers had never been allowed to excavate. 40 vampires filled the tiered seats, their stillness unnatural, their attention fixed on the small stage area where Mira stood with her violin, and tried not to think about the fact that she was surrounded by predators who could hear her racing heartbeat and smell her fear like perfume. Elias sat at the virginal he had brought from his vault, the original from 1624 with Elena's initials carved into the frame, his hands resting on the keys with a casualness that Mira knew was performance. All of this was performance except for the music, which was the only true thing in the room. They had not spoken since their argument 3 days ago, had not even exchanged texts to prepare for this moment. But when she raised her bow and met his eyes across the instruments, she saw something flicker in his expression that might have been apology or might have been farewell. She began to play, and Elias joined her on the second measure, their parts interweaving with the precision of something that had been waiting 400 years to be heard again. And Mira felt Elena's melody singing through her fingers as though the dead woman was guiding her hand. The music built and climbed and resolved into the final unfinished chord that hung in the air like a question without an answer, and when the last note faded, the silence in the chamber was so profound that Mira could hear her own breathing echoing off stone. Constantine began to applaud slowly, the sound sharp and deliberate, and around the amphitheater, other vampires joined him until the chamber filled with the hollow sound of hands clapping. "Remarkable," Constantine said, rising from his seat with predatory grace. "The Vampire King has found a human who plays his dead wife's part. Tell me, Miss Chen, does he call you Elena in the dark?" Mira saw Elias's jaw tighten, saw his fangs extend slightly as his vampire nature rose to the surface in response to the provocation, and she understood that this was the real trap. Not the performance, but what came after. "He does not call me anything," Mira said, setting down her violin with careful precision. "I am a musician. This is a job." "Then you will not mind playing for me," Constantine said, leaning forward with interest that felt predatory and cold. "I will triple whatever he is paying you." Mira felt the weight of every vampire in the room watching her, felt the political currents moving beneath the surface of what seemed like a simple offer, and she suddenly understood that council law allowed contract poaching if the human consented, a rule meant to prevent vampire monopolies on human talent, but weaponized now to strip Elias of the one thing he had allowed himself to want in centuries. She looked at Elias and saw what it would cost him to lose the song again. To have even this ghost of Elena taken away and given to a rival who would use it purely as a symbol of dominance. "I am not interested," Mira said clearly, her voice steady despite the fear making her hands shake. Constantine smiled, and it did not reach his eyes, his expression cold as winter. "Pity," he said softly. "I would have ensured you lived long enough to finish your career. Human lifespans are so brief." The chamber erupted in whispers, vampires leaning toward each other with commentary that Mira could not quite hear, and Elias moved with inhuman speed, crossing the space between them and taking her arm with a grip that was firm but not painful. They were out of the underground chamber and into a car before the council could react, before Constantine could say anything else. And in the back seat, Mira started shaking as adrenaline finally caught up with her nervous system. "He threatened me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He did worse," Elias said grimly, staring straight ahead as the car pulled away from the curb. "He marked you." The brownstone in Brooklyn belonged to Amara, and was warded with protections Mira could feel but not see, a weight in the air that suggested nothing uninvited could cross the threshold without triggering defenses she did not want to imagine. Elias paced the length of the living room while Amara made tea in the kitchen, the ritual of preparation offering comfort, even though Mira knew the vampire archivist did not drink it herself. "By publicly refusing Constantine, you became a status symbol," Elias explained, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Now every vampire who wants to undermine me has incentive to target you, to take you, hurt you, or turn you just to prove they can. You have become a piece on a chessboard I never should have brought you to." Mira set down her teacup with enough force that it cracked against the saucer. "You should have told me this would happen. I did not sign up to be a pawn in your vampire politics." "You are right," Elias said, and the admission seemed to cost him something, his shoulders dropping as though a weight had finally become too much to carry. "I was selfish. I wanted the song. I wanted to hear her music again, wanted to feel something besides the cold that has been my existence for 4 centuries. I will erase your memory. You can go back to your life. I will make sure Constantine understands you are off limits. That you were compelled and had no real choice in any of this." Part of Mira wanted exactly that, wanted to forget vampires and councils, and the way Elias looked when he played Elena's song with his eyes closed, and his face transformed by grief into something almost human. But she had seen too much, felt too much, and the music had connected her to something bigger than subway platforms and tip jars, and the small, careful life she had been building out of rejection letters and compromise. "I want to finish the song," Mira said suddenly, the words coming before she had fully formed the thought behind them. "The real way. Not this duet. There is a third movement. I can feel it in the structure." Elena meant to write more. Elias stared at her as though she had spoken a language he had forgotten how to understand. "How do you know that?" "Because the harmony does not resolve," Mira said, pulling out the sheet music she had brought with her, the 12 pages of vellum that Elias had preserved for 400 years. She pointed to the final measures where Elena's violin line hung, suspended on a cord that wanted to go somewhere else, that was waiting for something. "This is not an ending. This is a question waiting for an answer." Elias studied the notation with eyes that had read more music than Mira could imagine, and his expression shifted from skepticism to wonder as he traced the melodic line with one finger. "She always said the song was incomplete," he said quietly. "I thought she meant the keyboard part, that she had not finished writing out the accompaniment. But you are right. The harmonic structure suggests a third voice, something that would answer the question the duet asks." "Then we finish it," Mira said, feeling certainty settle into her bones like the rightness of a perfect fifth. "Together. And maybe when it is done, you can let her rest." Amara stood in the kitchen doorway watching them with an expression that suggested she had seen this kind of hope before and knew exactly how much it could cost. But she said nothing as Elias and Mira bent over the sheet music together, searching for the ghost of a melody that Elena had never lived to write down. Mira spent the next 2 weeks living in a suspended state between her old life and something she could not yet name, working on the third movement in Elias's penthouse, where the virginal sat like a monument to the past, and her violin case rested against the wall like a promise of the future. Elias provided details about Elena's compositional style with the precision of someone who had spent 4 centuries memorizing every quirk and preference, explaining how she loved complex fugues that turned back on themselves like labyrinths, how she favored unexpected modulations that shifted the emotional ground beneath the listener's feet without warning. She would start in a minor key and resolve in its relative major, Elias said one evening as they sat side by side at the piano, his hands demonstrating on the keys, while Mira took notes in the margins of manuscript paper. She believed music should surprise you, should take you somewhere you did not expect to go, but once you arrived, you could not imagine having gone anywhere else. Mira absorbed everything, stealing techniques and ideas from a woman 400 years dead. And slowly the third movement began to take shape under her hands, a melody that wove the violin and keyboard themes together before fracturing into something entirely new. The late nights accumulated into a routine that felt dangerously domestic, Mira working at the piano until exhaustion overtook discipline, and she would fall asleep with her head pillowed on her arms, the manuscript pages scattered around her like fallen leaves. The first time it happened, Elias let her sleep for 20 minutes before gently shaking her awake, but the second time he simply covered her with a blanket from the bedroom and sat in the nearby chair watching her breathe, remembering what it was like to be human enough to need sleep, to be vulnerable and mortal and blissfully unaware that monsters existed. She looked younger in sleep, the worry lines around her eyes smoothing out, and Elias felt something shift in his chest that was not quite pain, but close enough to make him turn away before the feeling could name itself. "Did you love her? Or do you just love grief?" Mira asked one night without preamble, setting down her pencil and turning to face him with the directness that he had come to expect and dread in equal measure. The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and Elias considered lying, considered offering some romantic platitude about eternal devotion, but Mira's eyes were too clear and too knowing for anything but truth. "I do not know anymore," he admitted finally, the words tasting like confession. "When I remember Elena now, I am not sure if I am remembering her or remembering my memory of her. The same scenes played so many times they have worn smooth like stones in a river. I remember loving her. I remember the feeling of it. But the feeling itself has become a story I tell myself about who I used to be." Mira nodded as though she had expected exactly that answer, as though she had asked the question already knowing what he would say, but needing him to hear it spoken aloud. "Maybe finishing the song is not about bringing her back," Mira said gently. "Maybe it is about letting yourself say goodbye." The breakthrough came 3 days later at 2 in the morning when Mira had been working for 6 hours straight, and her fingers were cramping and her eyes burned from reading notation by lamplight. She had been trying to force the third movement to resolve back into Elena's original themes, trying to create unity and closure. But everything she wrote felt false and mechanical, music that was technically correct but emotionally dead. Then she stopped trying to resolve it at all, stopped trying to bring the melody home, and instead let it fracture into something entirely new, a theme that honored the past without being imprisoned by it, that acknowledged grief while reaching towards something beyond grief. She played it through once with shaking hands, the new movement weaving both the violin and keyboard themes together before spinning off into unexplored harmonic territory, and when she finished the last chord, she turned to find Elias standing behind her with tears running down his face. He made no sound, did not move to wipe them away, simply stood there with 400 years of held grief finally breaking through the walls he had built around it, and Mira understood that she was witnessing something profound and private, a moment that would never come again. "It is beautiful," Elias said when he could speak, his voice rough and broken. Elena would have loved it. She would have said it was better than anything she wrote. "I am not so sure about that," Mira said, but she felt warmth spreading through her chest like sunlight, the satisfaction of having created something true. Elias crossed the distance between them and took her hands in his skin cool against her warmth, and for a moment Mira thought he might kiss her, might finally acknowledge the thing that had been building between them through all these late nights and shared music. Instead, he lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Formal and old-fashioned, and somehow more intimate than anything else could have been. "Thank you," he said simply, and Mira understood he was not just thanking her for the music. The attack came on a Tuesday morning when Mira had returned to the Brooklyn brownstone to sleep in a real bed for the first time in 3 days, her body demanding rest that she could no longer postpone. Amara was reading in the library when the wards shattered with a sound like breaking glass, vampires pouring through the doorway with coordinated precision that spoke of military planning. Amara moved with inhuman speed, placing herself between Mira and the intruders, her body becoming a weapon as she fought with the controlled fury of someone who had survived 200 years by never underestimating an enemy. "Get to the safe room," Amara shouted, throwing one vampire across the room hard enough to crack the wall, but there were too many, and they were too fast, and Mira barely made it halfway across the room before someone grabbed her from behind. She screamed and fought, violin training giving her stronger hands than most humans her size. But vampire strength made her resistance meaningless, and the last thing she saw before they drugged her unconscious was Amara going down under 3 attackers, blood spreading across the hardwood floor like spilled wine. Mira woke in a glass room that measured perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, the walls and ceiling transparent and reinforced, sitting in the middle of a warehouse that smelled of salt water and rust. Constantine sat in a leather chair perhaps 20 feet away, watching her with the patient interest of a scientist observing an experiment. And when he saw her eyes open, he smiled without warmth or humanity. "Good morning, Miss Chen," he said in his Balkan accent. "I apologize for the accommodations, but I wanted you to have an excellent view of what comes next." "What do you want?" Mira asked, proud that her voice came out steady despite the fear making her heart race and her hands shake. "Leverage," Constantine said simply. "Elias will receive word soon. Your safety in exchange for his abdication. He steps down as Vampire King and cedes his territory to European Council control." "And if he refuses," Mira said, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken. "Then you become an object lesson in the cost of caring for humans," Constantine replied. "Either way, I win. If he abdicates, I gain territory and eliminate a rival. If he refuses, I prove him weak and unfit to lead. The politics are quite elegant, really." Mira looked around her glass prison, memorizing the space and looking for weaknesses even though she knew escape was likely impossible, but sitting still felt like surrender, and surrender felt like death. The warehouse was old, brick walls and high windows, loading dock doors at one end, suggesting they were near the waterfront. She could see perhaps a dozen vampires scattered throughout the space, some watching her with predatory interest, while others seemed bored. And she understood that to them, she was not a person, but a tool, a means to an end that would be discarded once her usefulness expired. Elias received the message 18 hours after Mira's kidnapping. A video sent to his phone showing her sitting in the glass room with Constantine's terms laid out in his measured voice. The council convened an emergency session within the hour, vampire politics moving at supernatural speed when the situation demanded it. Half the council advised acceptance, their arguments pragmatic and cold. She is one human, Lady Chen pointed out, no relation to Mira despite the shared surname. You are a king responsible for an entire territory. Abdicating preserves stability and prevents war. The other half saw capitulation as weakness that would invite further challenges. If you bow to this, you are finished either way, Sebastian said bluntly. Every vampire with ambition will see you as someone who can be manipulated through human attachments. You will spend eternity defending yourself against similar gambits. Elias sat in silence while they argued, his face an expressionless mask that gave nothing away, but inside him something ancient and violent was waking, the part of himself he had kept carefully controlled for centuries, because once released it would not stop until everything in its path was destroyed. He would not negotiate, would not trade his position for Mira's safety, because negotiation implied Constantine had the right to make demands, and Elias would not grant him that legitimacy. I am going to kill him, Elias said quietly, and the council chamber fell silent. You cannot, Lady Chen protested. Council law forbids assassination of visiting dignitaries. It creates international incidents. Council law allows lethal response in defense of registered humans under our protection, Elias corrected, his voice cold as winter. Constantine has committed an act of war. I am simply responding in kind. He stood and left the chamber before anyone could argue further, before Sebastian could offer support, or Lady Chen could cite more regulations, because the thing waking inside him did not care about politics or laws or consequences, cared only about getting Mira back, regardless of what it cost. Mira had been in the glass room for 22 hours when Constantine decided to explain his real motivations, apparently bored with waiting and wanting an audience for his triumph. You should understand this is not really about territory, he said conversationally, as though discussing weather rather than kidnapping and murder. Elias has ruled too long, grown too powerful, forgotten that vampire society functions through balance, and no one king should dominate for centuries without challenge. Love makes even kings into fools, he continued, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. I want to know if you understand what you have done to him. He was untouchable before you, feared and respected, and completely alone. You made him vulnerable. You made him care. And now he will destroy himself trying to save you, which is exactly what I want. Mira met his eyes through the glass and refused to look away, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. If he destroys himself saving me, at least he will have been human one more time before the end, she said. Better to feel something real, even if it hurts, than to spend eternity pretending you are already dead. Constantine laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. You think love redeems him? He has killed thousands, hunted a family to extinction, including a child. He is a monster who has found a human pet. That is not redemption. That is delusion. Maybe, Mira agreed, but it is his delusion to have, not yours. Elias arrived alone 3 hours before dawn, the warehouse door slamming open with enough force to tear it from its hinges, and Mira saw him silhouetted against the streetlights like something out of nightmare. He moved with inhuman speed, a blur of violence that left vampires dying before they could react, and Mira understood for the first time what it meant that he was a king, that he had survived 4 centuries not through luck, but through being more dangerous than anything that challenged him. The combat was brutal and fast, vampires moving too quickly for human eyes to track. But Mira saw enough, saw Elias tear through Constantine's guards with efficiency that spoke of centuries of practice, saw him take a blade to the shoulder without slowing down, saw him fight with the kind of focused rage that would not stop until everything opposing him was destroyed or he was. Constantine met him in the center of the warehouse, their confrontation finally happening with Mira trapped in her glass room as unwilling audience. They were more evenly matched than the guards had been, both ancient and powerful, trading blows that would have killed younger vampires instantly. "You care for her," Constantine said, circling like a predator. "That makes you weak." "It makes me remember what I am fighting for," Elias replied, and drove a stake through Constantine's chest with enough force to crack ribs. The older vampire staggered but did not fall, pulling the stake free with a snarl, and Mira saw her chance. She had been testing the glass walls for 24 hours, pressing and kicking and looking for any weakness, and she had found one, a small crack near the base where the glass met the concrete floor. She grabbed the metal chair that was the room's only furniture and smashed it against the crack with all her strength, once, twice, 3 times, until the glass spiderwebbed and then shattered outward. She ran toward the loading dock, toward escape and safety, but one of Constantine's remaining vampires intercepted her, grabbing her arm with bruising force. Mira did not think, did not plan, simply grabbed a steel pipe from the debris scattered around the warehouse and swung it like a baseball bat, connecting with the vampire's head hard enough to make him release her with a hiss of pain. She kept swinging, kept fighting, no longer the helpless human waiting to be rescued, but someone who refused to make it easy for the monsters trying to kill her. Elias saw her fighting and something in his chest cracked open, pride and terror mixing into something he could not name, and the distraction cost him. Constantine drove a stake toward his heart, and Elias twisted at the last second, taking it through the shoulder instead, but the blessed wood burned like acid and his vision went dark at the edges. He fell to his knees, wounded and bleeding, and Constantine raised a second stake for the killing blow. Then Mira was there, her steel pipe connecting with Constantine's arm hard enough to break bones, and the older vampire turned toward her with a snarl. Big mistake. Elias moved with the last of his strength, grabbing Constantine from behind and driving his hand through the vampire's chest, ripping out the heart before the other could react. Constantine crumbled to ash, and Elias collapsed beside the remains, his shoulder still bleeding, the stake protruding from the wound like an accusation. Mira dropped her pipe and ran to him, her hands hovering over the injury without knowing how to help. "Do not touch it," Elias gasped. "Blessed wood. Burns." "Then I will not touch it," Mira said, but she stayed beside him, her presence an anchor, until Sebastian arrived with council reinforcements to secure the scene. Elias's injuries healed slowly over the next 2 days, vampire regeneration hampered by the blessed wood that had poisoned his system, and by the second night he was pale and weak in a way that frightened Mira more than the combat had. "He needs blood," Amara said bluntly, her own injuries bandaged but healing. "Fresh human blood. He has been refusing the stored supply." Elias lay on the couch in his penthouse looking more dead than alive, his skin gray and his breathing shallow, and when Mira knelt beside him, his eyes opened with visible effort. "You need to feed," she said gently. "Amara says fresh blood will help you heal." "I will not take from you," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "I swore I would never make you a source." "You are dying because you saved me," Mira said, rolling up her sleeve with shaking hands. "Do not make it meaningless. Let me help." Elias tried to protest, but his body was failing, the poison spreading faster than his depleted system could fight it. And when Mira held her wrist to his lips, his control finally broke. He bit down carefully, precisely, his fangs piercing her skin with surprising gentleness, and Mira gasped at the sensation, pain and intimacy mixing into something she had not expected. It felt like being seen, like being known, like sharing something more fundamental than blood. Elias drank for perhaps 30 seconds before forcing himself to pull away, sealing the wound with his tongue the way vampire saliva could. And Mira felt dizzy but whole, aware that something had shifted between them. "A faint blood tie," Amara said later, examining them both with clinical interest. "Not a full bond, but close enough." The council will consider you linked now. If she dies, your sanity becomes questionable. If you die, she loses supernatural protection. Sebastian visited the next evening when Elias was strong enough to sit up and Mira was sleeping in the bedroom, exhausted from blood loss and adrenaline crash. You have bound yourself to a human, Sebastian said without preamble, sitting in the chair across from Elias with an expression that mixed concern and resignation. Do you understand what that means? When she ages, when she dies, you will go through losing Elena all over again. Except you will be aware this time. You will watch it happen. I know, Elias said quietly, watching the bedroom door as though he could see through it to where Mira slept. And it terrifies me. But I would rather have 30 or 40 or 50 years with her than spend another 400 years alone. Sebastian studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You have fallen in love with her. Not because she reminds you of Elena, because she is herself. Yes, Elias said, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones like music finally resolving to its proper key. Mira Chen is stubborn and brilliant and brave enough to fight vampires with a steel pipe. She composed a third movement that made me weep. She offered me her blood when I was dying without hesitation. I love her. Not as a replacement, not as a ghost, as herself. Then I hope you are prepared for the heartbreak, Sebastian said, but his tone was gentle. Because humans do not live forever and you will. I know, Elias repeated, but maybe some things are worth the pain. The announcement went out 3 weeks after Constantine's death. A formal press release from the office of Elias Voss stating that he would be sponsoring a special concert at Carnegie Hall featuring the world premiere of a newly discovered 3-movement suite by the 17th-century Italian composer Elena Vittoria, performed by violinist Mira Chen, with Elias himself on historical keyboard. The human world received the news with polite interest, classical music blogs speculating about the mysterious antiquities dealer who had apparently unearthed a lost masterwork and decided to fund its debut rather than selling it to a museum. The vampire world understood immediately what the concert actually represented, a public declaration that Elias had chosen his human over discretion, that he was willing to expose himself to scrutiny and risk just to give Mira this moment. The weeks leading up to the performance passed in a blur of rehearsals and logistics, Mira working with the Carnegie Hall staff to coordinate lighting and acoustics while simultaneously practicing until her fingers cramped and her bow arm ached. She had played thousands of hours in her life, subway platforms and student recitals and wedding gigs, but never anything like this. Never a stage this prominent with stakes this high. The media attention built slowly, and then all at once, classical music critics expressing interest in the unknown composer and the unusual sponsorship arrangement, lifestyle magazines running profiles on the mysterious violinist who had seemingly appeared from nowhere to land Carnegie Hall. Mira did interviews where she carefully sidestepped questions about her relationship with Elias, described Elena Vittoria as a forgotten genius whose work deserved recognition, and tried not to think about the fact that half the audience would be vampires watching for political signals rather than musical merit. Elias handled the business side with efficiency that came from centuries of practice, but Mira caught him sometimes staring at the manuscript pages with an expression she could not quite read, something between grief and wonder. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked him one evening a week before the concert. Playing her music in public means letting go of it as a private memorial. It means other people will perform it, interpret it, change it. I know, Elias said quietly. That is the point. Elena wrote music to be heard, not locked in a vault where only I could mourn over it. She would have wanted this. Would she have wanted the third movement? Mira asked, because the question had been gnawing at her. The part I wrote that moves past the grief. Or does that feel like betrayal? Elias turned to face her fully, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. She would have loved it, he said firmly. Because it does what she always tried to do with music. It takes pain and transforms it into something beautiful. You honored her by refusing to stay trapped in the tragedy. The night of the concert arrived with the inevitability of a storm, Carnegie Hall filling with an audience that had no idea they were watching vampire politics play out through classical music. Mira stood backstage in the green room wearing a black concert gown that Elias had insisted on buying her. Simple and elegant and expensive enough to make her nervous about spilling anything on it. Her violin case sat on the dressing table, the instrument inside worth more than everything she had ever owned combined. A Guarneri that Elias had pulled from his vault, claiming Elena would have wanted her to play on the best. He appeared in the doorway 10 minutes before curtain wearing formal black that made him look like he had stepped out of a different century, his dark hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the timeless quality of his features. "You look terrified," he observed, not unkindly. "I am terrified," Mira admitted. "What if I mess up? What if I am not good enough? What if the third movement falls flat and everyone realizes I am a fraud who had no business touching Elena's work? Then you will be a human musician who tried something difficult and did not quite succeed," Elias said. "That is not a tragedy. That is just being alive. But you will not fail. I have heard you play this piece 100 times, and it is extraordinary. Trust yourself the way I trust you." Mira took a shaky breath and nodded, trying to channel some of his certainty into her own nervous system. They walked to the wings together, and Mira peeked out at the audience, seeing the full house that represented the biggest crowd she had ever played for, easily 2,000 people filling the ornate hall. She could not tell which ones were vampires just by looking, but she knew they were there, council members and rival factions and vampires who had come to see what Elias's human could do. The lights dimmed, and Elias walked onto the stage first, settling himself at the virginal that had been carefully transported from his penthouse and tuned to period specifications. Mira followed with her violin, the stage lights bright and warm after the cool darkness of the wings, and she heard the rustle of programs and the subtle clearing of throats that meant the audience was settling into attention. She lifted her violin to her shoulder, met Elias's eyes across the instruments, and began to play. The first movement was Elena's original, the piece that had survived 400 years in Elias's keeping, and Mira played it exactly as written with only minimal ornamentation. The melody was heartbreaking in its simplicity. A song about love and loss written by a woman who had not yet experienced either fully, and Mira felt the audience lean forward as the music filled the hall. She could feel their attention like a physical weight, 2,000 people holding their breath, and she poured everything she had into making Elena's voice heard across the centuries. The second movement was the duet she had reconstructed, violin and keyboard interweaving in complex counterpoint, and here Mira and Elias became partners in the truest sense, listening to each other with the intensity that came from weeks of rehearsal and deeper understanding. She watched his hands on the keys and remembered the first time she had heard him play, the grief that had saturated every note. But tonight something had shifted. He was playing with precision and passion, but also with a kind of peace, as though he had finally given himself permission to honor Elena without being destroyed by her memory. Then came the third movement, Mira's composition that took both themes and wove them together before fracturing into new harmonic territory. This was the piece she had written in Elias's penthouse at 2 a.m, with cramping fingers and burning eyes, the music that had made him weep, and she played it now like a prayer or a promise. The melody climbed and soared, acknowledged grief without drowning in it, and built toward a resolution that felt like sunrise after a long night. Mira closed her eyes for the final measures, letting muscle memory guide her fingers, and when the last note faded into silence, the hall held its breath for 3 full seconds before erupting into applause. The standing ovation started in the orchestra section and spread like wildfire, people rising to their feet with genuine enthusiasm rather than polite obligation, and Mira felt tears stinging her eyes as she lowered her violin and bowed. Elias stood from the virginal and crossed to stand beside her, taking her hand and raising it in acknowledgement. And Mira saw something in his face that looked like pride and love and painful hope all mixed together. They took 3 curtain calls before the stage manager finally signaled that it was time to exit, and backstage Mira collapsed into a chair with shaking hands and a heart that felt too large for her chest. "You were perfect," Elias said, kneeling beside her chair and taking both her hands in his. "Elena would have been so proud." "I wish I could have known her," Mira said, and meant it. "She must have been extraordinary." "She was," Elias agreed. "And so are you." The reviews the next morning called the performance hauntingly transcendent, praised Mira's technical skill and emotional depth, and speculated endlessly about the mysterious Elena Vittoria whose work had been lost for so long. Classical music. Twitter exploded with debate about attribution and authenticity, and whether the third movement was actually period appropriate or a modern addition, and Mira watched the discourse unfold with a mixture of pride and surrealism. But the vampire response was more complicated and arrived in the form of a council summons delivered to Elias's penthouse 48 hours after the concert. The emergency session convened in the underground chamber with full attendance, every council member present, and dozens of other vampires filling the tiered seats to witness what everyone seemed to know was coming. Elias stood in the center of the floor with Mira beside him, both of them facing Sebastian, who had assumed the role of council speaker in the absence of clear leadership. "The performance was beautiful," Sebastian began, his tone formal and careful. "It was also a clear political statement. You have chosen to publicly align yourself with a human in a way that cannot be ignored or dismissed. Ancient statute forbids vampire rulers from forming permanent bonds with humans," he continued, and Mira felt ice forming in her stomach. "The reasoning is practical. Such bonds create risk of compromise, exposure, and instability. A ruler who can be manipulated through attachment to a mortal becomes a liability to all vampires under their protection. Therefore, we offer you a choice," Sebastian said, and his expression suggested he took no pleasure in the ultimatum. "Remain vampire king and sever all ties with Mira Chen, or abdicate your position and keep your bond with her. You have until sunset tomorrow to decide." The chamber erupted in murmurs, vampires leaning toward each other with commentary that ranged from shocked to satisfied depending on their political allegiances, and Mira felt Elias's hand tighten around hers. "We need to talk," she said quietly, and they left the chamber without asking permission, walking out into the night air that felt cold after the stifling tension underground. They returned to the penthouse, and Mira paced the length of the living room while Elias stood by the window in the posture she had come to recognize as his thinking stance, still and silent as stone. "I am not asking you to give up anything," Mira said finally, the words bursting out of her like a dam breaking. "I never asked for this bond. I did not even know what it meant when you fed from me. You cannot throw away 300 years as vampire king because of me." "But I want to," Elias said quietly, turning to face her. "That is what you are not understanding. I have been king for 3 centuries, and it has given me power and purpose and exactly 0 moments of genuine happiness. You have given me more joy in 3 months than I have felt in 400 years. The title is not worth losing that." "You do not know that yet," Mira argued. "Give it time. Let the bond fade. Maybe in a few years you will realize this was infatuation or transference or something other than love, and you will regret having sacrificed everything." Sebastian appeared in the doorway without knocking, his ability to bypass locks a reminder that he was himself ancient and powerful. "There is a loophole," he said without preamble. "The law forbids permanent bonds with humans. If Mira agrees to be turned, she would be vampire, not human. The statute would not apply." Mira felt her whole body go cold at the suggestion, vampire transformation being the one thing she had never seriously considered, despite everything else she had accepted. "I do not want to be a vampire," she said clearly, looking at Sebastian and then at Elias. I do not want to drink blood and never see sunlight and watch everyone I know age and die while I stay frozen. I want to be human. I want to grow old. I want to be me. Elias crossed the room and took her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the supernatural strength in his fingers. Then you will be human and grow old and be yourself, he said firmly. I would never ask you to change that. Sebastian nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. Then you know what you have to do. The formal abdication happened the next evening in the council chamber, with all the ceremony that 400 years of vampire tradition demanded. Elias signed the papers that transferred his title and territory and all associated powers to Sebastian as interim king, the documents ancient and binding, written in languages that predated English and sealed with supernatural oaths that could not be broken. He spoke the ritual words renouncing his claim to rulership, and Mira watched as something shifted in the chamber's atmosphere, power reallocating itself to settle on Sebastian instead. The council promised to honor Elias's life in recognition of his centuries of service, meaning he would not be executed for the political inconvenience of his abdication. But he lost everything else in that moment, lost his protection and territory and title, lost his place in the hierarchy that had defined him for 300 years, became just another vampire in a city full of them, with no special status and no guaranteed safety. When it was finished and the papers were signed and witnessed, Elias walked out of the chamber as an ordinary vampire for the first time since 1724. Mira followed him into the night, and they stood on the street corner in the financial district surrounded by humans who had no idea they were witnessing the end of an era. You gave up everything for me, Mira said. Guilt and gratitude and fear all mixing into something that felt like drowning. I gave up a throne, Elias corrected, pulling her close with arms that were still inhumanly strong even without a crown. I kept what matters. They returned to the penthouse that was no longer a seat of power, but just an apartment, expensive and empty, and theirs. Elias no longer had council obligations or territorial responsibilities or political meetings that consumed his nights. Mira no longer had to navigate vampire politics or worry about being used as leverage against a vampire king. They were ordinary now, in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating, just a vampire and a musician trying to figure out what came next. The music industry wanted more from Mira after the Carnegie Hall success. Orchestras reaching out with commission requests and conductors asking about future performances, and she said yes to the opportunities that excited her and no to the ones that felt like selling out. Elias sold most of his antiquities collection to fund their new life, keeping only the pieces that held genuine meaning rather than just monetary value, and discovered that he had no idea who he was without a kingdom to rule. They fought sometimes in those first months, sharp arguments about Mira's touring schedule taking her away, or Elias's tendency to be overprotective, about practical matters like whose turn it was to do dishes, and deeper issues like what they were building together. But they also laughed, shared late nights working on music, learned how to be partners without the weight of politics crushing everything. Sebastian visited occasionally, bringing news from the council and checking on his predecessor with what seemed like genuine concern rather than political maneuvering. You seem happier, he observed one evening, accepting the glass of whiskey Elias offered even though vampires could not get drunk. I am, Elias admitted. It is strange and difficult, and I have no idea what I am doing half the time, but I am happier than I have been in centuries. That is the cost of love, Sebastian said. Uncertainty and vulnerability, and the constant knowledge that you will lose her eventually. But also joy and connection, and the feeling of being alive even when you are technically dead. Exactly, Elias agreed, glancing toward the music room where Mira was practicing scales with the dedication that had first caught his attention. Worth every sacrifice. 6 months after the abdication, Mira premiered a new composition at a smaller venue in Brooklyn, a piece for solo violin that she had written during the adjustment period when everything felt uncertain and frightening. The audience was mostly human, with only a handful of vampires in attendance, and Elias sat in the third row, watching her play with an expression that anyone could read as love. The piece was technically complex and emotionally raw, music about choosing uncertainty over safety, about loving someone despite knowing you would lose them, about finding home in another person rather than in power or position. When she finished and took her bow, Elias was the first on his feet applauding, and Mira met his eyes across the crowd and smiled. They had both given up kingdoms in their own ways. Elias his literal throne, and Mira her dreams of mainstream success that would have required safer choices and more conventional relationships. What they had built instead was smaller and stranger and more fragile, a partnership that violated vampire law and defied human expectations, that would end eventually when mortality claimed Mira and left Elias to grieve again. But tonight, under the stage lights with applause filling the small venue, it felt like enough. Felt like exactly the right choice. Felt like the kind of love worth writing songs about, even knowing how the story would end. Backstage afterward, Mira collapsed into Elias's arms with the exhausted satisfaction of having performed well. "That was incredible," he said, kissing her temple. "The harmonic progression in the third section made me want to weep." "Good weeping or bad weeping?" Mira asked, laughing, "because with you it is sometimes hard to tell." "Good weeping," Elias assured her, "the kind that means the music reached something true." They left the venue hand in hand, walking through Brooklyn streets that were still warm from the summer day, and Mira thought about all the ways her life had changed since that night she had played in the subway and caught a vampire's attention. She had lost her anonymity and gained a reputation, had signed supernatural contracts and survived vampire politics, had fallen in love with someone who would watch her age while he stayed frozen, who would eventually lose her the way he had lost Elena, who had given up everything he was to keep her. The future was uncertain and complicated and probably shorter than she wanted it to be, but right now, walking through Brooklyn with Elias's cool hand wrapped around her warm one, Mira could not imagine having chosen differently. This was the life she wanted, strange and dangerous and absolutely her own, and she would live it fully for however long she had. That was enough. That was everything. 6 months had passed since Elias signed away his crown, and the world had settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and surprisingly ordinary. They lived now in a small apartment in Brooklyn, Mira's place that had once seemed cramped for one person, and now somehow accommodated two, despite Elias bringing almost nothing with him except his instruments and a few carefully chosen books. The penthouse in Manhattan had been sold to settle debts and establish independence, the palace staff dismissed with generous severance, and Elias found himself navigating a life without servants or empire or the weight of 400 years of accumulated responsibility. He was learning to be ordinary in ways that would have seemed absurd during his reign, figuring out grocery shopping and attempting to cook with results that ranged from mediocre to borderline inedible. Mira teased him mercilessly about his inability to make anything more complex than toast. But she also found it oddly endearing to watch a centuries-old vampire standing in their tiny kitchen, frowning at a recipe like it was written in code. The Carnegie Hall performance had launched Mira's career in ways she had not quite anticipated, orchestras and chamber groups reaching out with opportunities that were modest but real. Paid gigs that meant she could cover rent without busking and actually build something sustainable. She was touring small venues across the Northeast, recording sessions for an independent label that specialized in contemporary classical. And while she was not famous in any mainstream sense, she was becoming known in circles that mattered. Critics praised her technical precision and emotional depth. Other musicians wanted to collaborate, and Mira found herself living the dream she had chased for years, even if it looked different than she had imagined. Elias attended her performances whenever his sensitivity to crowds and enclosed spaces allowed, sitting in the back row watching her command stages with a confidence that grew stronger each time. He was adjusting to a life without council business or territorial disputes, to nights that belonged entirely to himself rather than being parceled out among political obligations. He read voraciously, revisited composers he had neglected during his busy centuries, took long walks through Brooklyn neighborhoods that were still gentrifying and changing. Sometimes the weight of ordinariness felt crushing, the loss of purpose and identity leaving him unmoored. But other times it felt like freedom, like he had been released from a prison he had not realized he was in. They played music together in the evenings when Mira was not traveling, no audience and no pressure, just two people sharing melodies in an apartment that smelled like coffee and old books. Elias had acquired a modern piano to replace the virginal he had sold, and they worked through Bach inventions and improvised duets that went nowhere except into each other's laughter. These were the moments Elias treasured most, the simple domesticity of making music with someone he loved without any political subtext or supernatural complication. One evening in late autumn, when the air had turned crisp and the Brooklyn streets were covered in fallen leaves, Mira set down her violin and looked at Elias with an expression he could not quite read. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly, and he knew immediately what she meant, even though months had passed since the abdication. "Giving up the throne, choosing me over power. Do you ever wish you had made a different choice?" Elias considered the question seriously, rather than offering easy reassurance, thinking about the political influence he no longer wielded and the safety net that had disappeared when Sebastian became king. "I regret the 400 years I spent mourning instead of living," he said finally. "I regret that I let Elena's death define me for so long that I forgot how to be anything except grief. But I do not regret choosing you, not for a single moment." "Even knowing I will lose you eventually," Mira pressed, because they both understood the mathematics of their relationship, vampire immortality versus human mortality. "Even knowing you will watch me age and die the way you watched Elena." "Especially knowing that," Elias said firmly, reaching across the space between them to take her hand. "Because this time I am choosing to love someone fully while I have the chance, rather than hiding behind walls and responsibilities. This time I will have no regrets about time wasted or words unspoken. When you die, I will grieve, but I will not spend another 4 centuries paralyzed by it." Mira squeezed his hand and nodded, accepting the answer, even though he could see the sadness in her eyes at contemplating her own mortality. They sat together in comfortable silence while the autumn evening darkened outside their window, and Elias thought about how much had changed since that night he had first heard her playing in the subway. The next afternoon, while Mira was teaching violin lessons at a community center and Elias was attempting to make sense of their apartment's chaotic filing system, a letter arrived via courier. The envelope was heavy cream paper sealed with wax, and Elias recognized Amara's handwriting immediately, even before opening it. Inside was a brief note explaining that she had been conducting research in Italian archives as part of her work documenting vampire history and had discovered something she thought he needed to see. The historical document she had enclosed was a diary, pages carefully photographed and printed, and Elias felt his breath catch when he recognized Elena's handwriting. The entries dated from the last year of her life, intimate observations about daily life in Venice, and her relationship with the mysterious nobleman she had married. Elias read through them with hands that shook slightly, seeing Elena's personality come alive again through her words, her wit and intelligence and deep capacity for love evident in every sentence. Then he reached the entries from 3 months before her death, and everything he thought he understood about their relationship shattered. Elena had known he was a vampire, had figured it out through careful observation and deduction, noticing details like his avoidance of sunlight and mirrors and the way he never aged in the portraits that lined their palazzo. She wrote about her discovery with remarkable calm, working through the implications and deciding that his supernatural nature did not change her love for him. She had known for months and never confronted him about it, respecting his need for secrecy while privately grappling with what it meant to love someone inhuman. The final entry was written the day of her death, and Elias had to stop reading twice to compose himself before he could finish it. "If they come for me tonight," Elena had written, "know that I chose this. I chose to love you knowing what you are. I chose to stay even understanding the danger. And I would choose you in every life, in every version of this story, where we find each other. You are worth the risk. You have always been worth everything." Elias set down the pages with tears streaming down his face. 400 years of guilt dissolving in the space between one breath and the next. He had spent centuries believing that Elena had died, not knowing the truth about him, that his deception had robbed her of informed choice and agency, had carried the weight of that betrayal like a stone around his neck, punishing himself for the lie, even while understanding why he had kept it. But she had known all along, had chosen him anyway, had gone to her death understanding exactly what loving a vampire meant and deciding it was worth it. The guilt that had defined him since 1625 crumbled into dust, replaced by grief that was clean and pure rather than poisoned by shame. He mourned Elena still, would always mourn the loss of her, but he no longer carried the burden of feeling responsible for deceiving her. She had made her choice with open eyes and a full heart, and honoring that meant accepting her agency rather than drowning in guilt. When Mira came home hours later, she found Elias sitting on their couch, surrounded by the printed diary pages, his face wet with tears, but his expression lighter than she had ever seen it. "What happened?" she asked, dropping her violin case and crossing to kneel beside him. He showed her the diary and explained Amara's discovery, and Mira read through Elena's final entry with her own eyes filling. "She loved you so much," Mira said softly when she finished reading, "and she wanted you to know that her choice was real and informed, and hers. You do not have to carry guilt anymore." "I know," Elias said, and the relief in his voice was profound. "For 400 years I thought I had stolen her agency by not telling her the truth. But she knew. She chose me anyway. The weight of that realization has freed something I did not know was still trapped." They sat together surrounded by Elena's words, and Elias felt the last chains of his grief finally release their hold. He would always love Elena, would always treasure the 2 brief years they had together, but he was no longer imprisoned by mourning her. She had given him permission to move forward. Written 400 years ago, but received exactly when he needed it, and he intended to honor that gift by living fully rather than merely existing. 2 weeks later, on a clear November evening, Mira and Elias climbed to the rooftop of their apartment building, carrying her violin and a blanket to sit on. The city spread out below them in a carpet of lights, Brooklyn and Manhattan glittering against the darkness, and the air was cold enough that Mira's breath misted while Elias remained comfortably unaffected by temperature. She had been working on a new composition for weeks, scribbling ideas in notebooks during long train rides and humming melodies while washing dishes, and tonight she was finally ready to share it. "This is not Elena's song," Mira said, as she tuned her violin with practiced efficiency. "And it is not the duet we performed at Carnegie Hall. This is something new, something that is entirely ours." She lifted the instrument to her shoulder and began to play, and Elias listened with complete attention as the melody unfolded. The piece was simpler than her previous compositions, more modern in its harmonic language, but it carried an emotional weight that came from honest observation rather than manufactured drama. It was music about finding home in another person, about choosing love despite uncertainty, about building something new rather than clinging to the past. The violins sang clear and bright in the cold air, the notes drifting across the rooftop and dispersing into the November night, and Elias felt something shift inside him as he listened. For the first time in centuries, he was not looking backward, not measuring the present against memories of Elena or comparing every experience to his lost golden age. He was fully present in this moment, with this woman playing this music, grateful for what he had rather than grieving what he had lost. Mira finished the piece and lowered her violin, looking at Elias with an expression that mixed hope and vulnerability. "What do you think?" she asked, needing his honest opinion rather than empty reassurance. Elias crossed the rooftop to stand beside her, taking her free hand in his and pressing a kiss to her cold knuckles. "It is perfect," he said sincerely. "It sounds like us, like everything we have been through and everything we are building. Play it again." Mira smiled and lifted her violin once more, beginning the piece again from the opening measures, and Elias settled onto the blanket to listen with the patience that came from having infinite time. The music filled the rooftop and drifted down to the street below, where the city continued its endless rhythm of movement and noise and life. A figure watched from the shadows across the street, and if Elias had been paying attention to anything except Mira's playing, he would have recognized Sebastian's distinctive stillness. The interim vampire king stood perfectly motionless on the Brooklyn sidewalk, his enhanced hearing easily picking up the violin's melody from 5 stories up, and his expression was unreadable. After several measures, he nodded once, a gesture that could have meant approval or warning or simple acknowledgement that he knew where his predecessor lived. Then Sebastian turned and disappeared into the night with supernatural speed, leaving no trace except the faint displacement of air that marked his passing. The vampire world had not forgotten Elias, would never forget a king who had abdicated for love, and Sebastian's presence was a reminder that they were still being watched, still being evaluated, still connected to politics and power games, even in their Brooklyn apartment far from the council chambers. But for now, on this rooftop under the November sky, none of that mattered. Mira played, and Elias listened, and the song drifted into the night, simple and hopeful and entirely their own. The future remained uncertain. Vampire politics still lurked at the edges of their ordinary life, and mortality would eventually claim Mira, leaving Elias to face another loss. But whatever came next, they would face it together. Two people who had chosen each other against all logic and tradition, who had given up kingdoms to build something smaller and more precious. The music continued, violin notes rising into the darkness, and Elias closed his eyes and let himself feel grateful. Grateful for Elena, who had loved him enough to choose him knowingly. Grateful for Mira, who had somehow seen past his walls and brought him back to life. Grateful for this moment, and this music, and this impossible love that had saved him from an eternity of mourning. When the piece ended, Mira set down her violin and curled against Elias's side, tucking herself under his arm and resting her head on his shoulder. They sat together watching the city lights and listening to the distant sounds of traffic and voices and all the noise of human life continuing around them. "You know this is not over," Mira said quietly, because they both understood that vampire politics did not simply evaporate because someone abdicated. "Sebastian will keep tabs on us. The council will watch for any sign you are building influence again. We are not safe just because we are ordinary." "I know," Elias agreed, "but we are safer than we were, and we are together. That is enough for now." "For now," Mira echoed, and they let the words hang in the cold air between them, a promise and a question, and an acceptance of uncertainty. Below them, the city breathed and shifted, Brooklyn transforming block by block into something new while holding echoes of everything it had been. Above them, stars struggled to shine through the light pollution, ancient and distant, and entirely indifferent to the small dramas of vampires and humans. And on the rooftop, two people sat wrapped in each other's warmth, listening to the night and thinking about the future and holding on to the precious, fragile thing they had built together. The violin case sat open beside them, the instrument resting in velvet, and Mira's new composition sat in her music bag ready to be shared with the world. Tomorrow she would return to rehearsals, and Elias would attempt another cooking experiment, and life would continue in all its mundane, complicated glory. But tonight they had this moment, this quiet space carved out of the chaos, this song that belonged only to them. Whatever darkness waited in the shadows, whatever political machinations Sebastian was planning, whatever grief the future held when mortality finally claimed Mira, they would face it the way they had faced everything else. Together, with music, with love that had been worth every sacrifice. The night deepened and the city lights glittered, and somewhere in the distance, a subway rumbled beneath the streets carrying strangers to unknown destinations. Mira and Elias sat on their rooftop and watched the world turn, and for this one perfect moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The end was only a beginning. The song would continue, and love, as always, was worth the cost.